onto climate inaction news. Australia, the unofficial home of climate change, has been ranked last among the developed nations on climate performance and pledges. In the lead up to COP26, the Climate Council had labelled Australia the worst performing developed country in a report the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor, called misleading and complete rubbish. And these guys are surprised that nobody showed up to listen to Morrison speak at COP26.
Optimism as we gather here.
Some optimism, but plenty of scepticism too among COP delegates.
We all saw that coming. Nobody attends the press conferences held by the guy who came in last place at the Olympics, unless that person is Stephen Bradbury. Maybe this is what Morrison means when he uses the vague phrase, the Australian way, that all the countries ahead of us will fall over, and by virtue of being so far behind, we all manage to come out in front. And honestly, there is no reason to suspect that Australia is falling behind its OECD friends and counterparts. After all, it's not like we've become a dumping ground for more dangerous and polluting cars, as the federal government has not adopted international emissions standards. We would never do that. Footage of the outdated cars has been obtained by the Bureau of Weird News. So, can we see a clip?
Now it's my car!
More than 80% of the global car market now follows Euro 6 vehicle emission standards, including Europe, the United States, Japan, Korea, China, India, and Mexico. But Australia has resisted signing up to the standards, which would require more stringent restrictions on pollutants in petrol, and require new cars to emit far less particulate matter than currently allowed. And why should we? It's not like we have infinite sunshine countrywide, and as Scott Morrison has made clear,
It's not going to tow your trailer, it's not going to tow your boat, it's not going to get you out to your favourite camping spot with your family. Bill Shorten wants to end the weekend.
And electric vehicles certainly can't support your living blood bag as you chase down infidels in the desert. It's the Australian way. This is all according to a submission to a federal parliamentary inquiry into road safety. And even if the government signed onto Euro 6 fuel today, it would be years before the country was ready. And car manufacturers say this has made it difficult to sell their best vehicles in Australia, which require better quality fuel. So they're actually harming their good friend, the economy. Apparently the market is supposed to decide these things, but it seems that they aren't making room for the market to flourish when they're dumping millions in subsidies straight into the laps of coal companies. And not only is it costing the economy, but also it will cost people, you people, the good taxpayers, $1 trillion in health expenses by 2050 if we don't boost the take-up of electric vehicles, according to a new report released by the Australian Conservation Foundation. The report said a rapid transition of the entire private car fleet to EV by 2035, when coupled with better public transport systems, would see $492 billion in costs avoided. But we will not be committing to such lofty targets as saving $492 billion for the Australian taxpayer. No. They refused to pay co-pay for Medicare years ago, which definitely would have meant that some of the costs would have been saved and could better be invested in parking lots and Olympic-class sports training facilities for small towns with no real connection to the sport. If only they had committed. Well, I guess this is their fault now. Besides, it's not a race. It's not a race. It's not a race to get to EV cars first, and if it were, well, Norway would be the Usain Bolt of the race. If Usain Bolt realised that the starting pistol had been fired 20 years ago and actually started casually strolling towards the finish line while everyone else sat down and had 26 public summits about what could we possibly do about the dying planet. I mean, it's embarrassing that the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions, Angus Taylor, promoted Australia as a good place to invest in fossil fuel projects at COP26 in the year of our dying planet 2021. I mean, he isn't wrong. It certainly is a good place to invest in fossil fuel projects because it's one of the only places left where you can still make fossil fuel deals. So it's pretty good. Well, it's no wonder that Bill Hare, the chief executive of Climate Analytics, said Australia was hiding behind others, including Brazil, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, which are all trying to weaken the negotiating text. Because we are. We were one of several nations that did not support an agreement at COP26 talks requiring all countries to return to the negotiating table next year with stronger commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. I mean, he wasn't wrong. Australia never undergoes international action without having a larger and scarier country to hide behind. I mean, we go to war for fossil fuels all the time, and this isn't any different. We finally have the courage to go to war for fossil fuels of our own volition. We don't need a big Uncle Sam to hide behind this time. We even have detractors, like any good war does. Former PMs Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull lashed out at the Morrison government's cynical indifference and empty rhetoric as they assured Pacific leaders a majority of Australians are in your corner. I mean, the reassurance came in a letter to Pacific leaders, which kind of undermines the message a little bit. If you're going to send a reassuring message to the neighbours you are watching drown over the back fence due to your negligent use of natural resources, maybe don't send them a letter written on a natural resource. Just strikes me as a little bit insensitive. And while Kevin Rudd attempted to curb emissions by not removing the carbon tax that was already in place in his time, Turnbull has had a long, complicated history with emissions, approving multiple coal mines, overseeing a rise in emissions, ignoring advice that renewable energy was not to blame for the South Australian blackouts, and during his run in 2017, in an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald, Monash University economist Jacob Madsen said of Australia's economy, "The Australian economy is far too undiversified, deriving a large part of its foreign income from a few minerals and agricultural products." At this point, we are basically the weed dealer that nobody would hang out with if they just made cannabis legal. It's true. But sure, take some pot shots from the sidelines. You guys are in good company after all. Have a look here. David Attenborough taking pot shots at the PM. Ho ho ho! Shots fired. But, you know, you expect this sort of shit from lefty, greeny David Attenborough. He was responsible for Monty Python getting on the BBC. He has no idea what it is to be financially responsible. What does a conservative businessman say? What's Twiggy Forrest up to, hey? Let's check in on Twiggy. Ooh. Seems he and Mike Cannon-Brookes, the Altasian co-founder, are investors in the world's biggest solar farm in the middle of the Northern Territory. A giant power cable from the Simpson Desert to Singapore, which will give the 5.5 million strong island metropolis up to 15% of its total power needs, which comes to about roughly 3% of Australia's electricity needs a year. I did the maths, I checked. Even mining magnate Twiggy, I tried to overturn native title in WA forest, is investing in solar farms. Come on! But why invest in renewable energy when we can rely on Australians to do the work themselves, and then you get to wear the shine of their hard work? Particularly after a third draft text from the UN COP26 Climate Summit urged nations to accelerate the phase out of unfiltered coal and inefficient coal fuel subsidies after large emitters tried to remove the mention of polluting fuels. This text omitted any reference to specific finance for loss and damage, which has been a key demand of poorer nations. Because it should be. We should be paying these guys. Oh well. While we are toning down the text, let's take a look at the phase out phrasing. Seems a little strong. Can we make something a little less clear with less obvious target? What can we do instead? Oh, here we go. Looks like we are going to phase down the sector to address climate change. Well, that should definitely take care of the problem. No worries at all. It's not like climate scientists have slammed our response to climate change as comically flawed in our approach to ignoring the most abundant natural resource that we have, sunshine! And it's not like we're putting our economy at risk by refusing to invest in development of existing technologies which would actually serve to reduce around 80% of Australia's emissions if we actually bothered to take the time to invest in implementing them. No, don't be silly. It's just good to see that we're acting in a way that will set a good example and shows that we're taking our responsibilities, particularly to our neighbours, so very seriously. After all, we're following the Australian approach. And in Australia, we look after our neighbours.
Neighbours should be there for one another. That's when good neighbours become good friends.
Even former carbon tax skeptic and man who can't believe he successfully pulled off this grift, Matthias Cormann, has called for better global approach on carbon pricing. Matthias Cormann, of all people, Matthias Cormann used a speech as head of the OECD to urge countries to adopt an effective and fair approach to implementing a price on carbon emissions. But Matthias, is this you?
The people of Australia don't want this carbon tax.
Because it sure sounds like you. Nobody else in the parliament has that Schwarzenegger-sounding accent. We don't do foreigners, even if they are citizens. I mean, let's face it, we don't even do most citizens, even if they are citizens. What about this? Is this you?
And the people of Australia will judge her harshly for the deceit inflicted on them before the last election. History and the Australian people will judge every single Labor member and senator harshly for supporting a tax which clearly is not in our national interest, which clearly is going to inflict a lot of harm on household budgets, on the economy, without doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions.
Silly Matthias Cormann, you don't know what you want.